Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Iris Wagstaff and I am a STEM Program Director at AAAS. I'm also the NSF PI for the AAAS STEM Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited about today's topic as well as our speaker. Before we get started with the presentation, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First of all, we will have a Q&A session at the end of Shuli's presentation, so you can definitely go ahead and put questions in the question box, but we will address those questions at the end of the presentation. Second, we will have the slides and the webinar recording available for you no later than Wednesday or Thursday. They will be posted on our STEM website, and you'll also receive a follow-up email that will include the slides and the webinar recording. And last of all, we do have a resource tab with some items and information for you to access. In the resource tab, you will find links to our AAAS STEM website. You'll also find a link to the NSF STEM program site. We have a link to the survey that we'd like you to complete after the webinar. And then we also have links to our past webinar recordings and the slides in case you missed those. So let's get started. So the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, is the oldest and largest general scientific organization in the world. We were founded in the mid-1800s and have over 200,000 members worldwide. So most people know us from our science magazine, but we actually have a family of science journals, so make sure you check those out. Our mission is simple but large, and that's to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. We accomplish this mission through a variety of programs and initiatives. So along with the STEM initiative, we have a number of programs under our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department that include our Emerging Researchers National Conference in STEM, or EARN, where we support about 1,000 undergraduate and graduate STEM majors to come present their research. We have our L'Oreal for Women in Science Fellowship for female postdocs in STEM. We have our Entry Point program, which supports students in STEM with disabilities. And we also have our Sea Change initiative, which focuses on institutional change at the faculty level. For more information about AAAS, please visit our website. And we also have a number of other resources that includes our Science Careers website. Next slide, please. So our AAAS STEM initiative was awarded in 2018, and the title of this grant is Developing an Evidence-Based Best Practices Community for Supporting Low-Income, High-Achievement Students in STEM Education and the Workforce. And the goals and objectives, or the main goals and objectives of this initiative are to share effective education and workforce preparation strategies, to facilitate strategic collaboration and networking across STEM projects, and to generate a sense of community among those seeking to expand opportunities for low-income STEM students. We have been and are accomplishing these goals and objectives through a number of efforts. Our first effort was last year, where we convened the 2019 STEM Symposium in Washington, D.C. We had over 650 participants. The symposium included 5 amazing plenaries that included an opening address by France Cordova from NSF. We had about 30 workshops focused on different topics in STEM education. And we had about 100 poster presentations by STEM PIs. This year is our off-conference year, so we are convening a webinar series. We've had 2 webinars so far, and this is our 3rd one. If you missed those, you can find the slides and recordings as well as other information and content from our 2019 symposium on our STEM website. Next slide, please. So I really want to acknowledge our project team. We have a very small team. So in addition to myself, we have Allison Gonzalez, who's a program associate at AAAS. And then we have Kate Winter, who's our external evaluator. I'd also like to acknowledge our amazing advisory board members. Those include Karen Birch, David Brown, Kelly Mack, Yvette Pearson, and Ivory Tolson. Next slide, please. So since 2018, we have been working with a great group of SM program officers at NSF. In case you don't know them by face, we just wanted to acknowledge them. And those include Alex Medina Borgia, Keith Sperdra, Sammy Rollins, and Glenda Valdez. And we also have a link, again, if you have any questions that are specific to the program that might not be addressed in this webinar, please visit the NSF STEM program site. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We're really excited to have her. She is Shulie Wong, and she is a professor of educational leadership at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has many years of expertise supporting STEM faculty and student success at the community college level. Among her many honors include the Barbara K. Townsend Emerging Scholars Award by the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. And now I will hand it over to Shulie.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wagstaff, and also thank you to Allison Gonzalez for all the organizational support so far. I really appreciate this amazing opportunity. And so, audience members, good afternoon and good whichever time of the day to you all. I know we're all working out of different time zones. Also, I want to extend a personal hi again to the audience members who have interacted with me through conferences, talks, and other venues and capacities. I know several of you emailed me about this webinar. So in a time when everyone is virtually exhausted, pun intended here, you showing up today just speaks volume to your commitment to promoting STEM transfer pathways that are equitable. I mentioned that I'm so honored and delighted to be in community with you today through this webinar, because this has been a topic close and dear to my heart throughout my research career to date. And my recently released book, On My Own, represents the culmination of this work and some of my most recent thinking around this issue. So it will serve as the sort of empirical base for today's webinar, which I will be referencing from time to time. The reason why we're all here today is that we all hope to promote transfer in STEM, and so many of you have actually worked on the grounds toward that goal tirelessly over the years. But to further unpack why this matters as a national issue of concern from a larger education policy perspective, there is this big transfer aspiration attainment gap in terms of how many students entering community colleges hoping to transfer versus how few actually ending up doing so. This disconnect is true for all majors, but it's even greater for students in STEM, as I found through analysis of national databases in my earlier research. If we think about this disconnect, it is troublesome, especially when we think about transfer as one of the most democratizing functions of community colleges and, frankly, higher education writ large in the United States. In that sense, if we limit STEM education at the community college to job preparation at the so-called sub-baccalaureate level only, then this leaves out a huge group of brilliant STEM students who may desire to transfer, and essentially blocking their upward mobility in terms of their education and career. So building equitable transfer pathways in STEM and beyond is not just an issue at the individual level of whether a student realized their educational goals or not. I know we all at the individual level want to support students, but it's beyond the individual level. It's actually an issue of social mobility, equity, and justice. So to get there, let's ponder on this question within your specific capacities and contexts. What do equitable STEM transfer pathways mean and look like? You might have already thought about this question for quite a while. You might just start to think about this question this way right now. Regardless of where you are, if you could hold on to this question as sort of the backdrop as I continue to share what I have learned and particularly unlearned about this question from my research over the past 6 years. Speaking of those years of research, which was a lot of fun, speaking of that, a bit more about the empirical base for today's presentation. So the STEM transfer aspiration attainment gap I talked about a moment ago from my earlier research as a faculty member eventually motivated me to launch a large-scale study that collected original data to capture students' experiences on the ground. Supported by the National Science Foundation, this is back in fall 2014, I started a longitudinal mixed methods research project that followed a cohort of roughly 1,670 students beginning in STEM programs and courses at two-year institutions in a Midwestern state. In the years that followed, I worked with my amazing research team to gather data from these students through a variety of data sources, including multiple waves of surveys, in-person interviews, and then we also worked with my research partners and their institutional researchers in collecting college transcript records to follow these students' educational and life journeys over those years. So altogether, these sources of data helped us construct the very complex STEM transfer process as experienced by the students themselves on the ground. And here I want to say a word about relevance of this work, and more precisely in research terms, the so-called transferability of this work. Although this study is situated within a single state and specific to your institutions, I will say that the findings and implications coming out of this work have practical implications of great relevancy to other states and institutions working with STEM transfer students. I offer this as a researcher who studies the landscape of community colleges, transfer and STEM education, but also as confirmed by a number of readers and perhaps even some of the audience members who have already engaged with my work, my research, and my book. And also I say this not because I want to prove to you all how credible I am as a researcher and author. You know, no research is ever going to be bias-free or completely generalizable or objective, and I want to fully acknowledge that. I offer this simply because I want to provide all of us, myself included, a gentle reminder to avoid the not my problem mentality when we see issues of concern happening in the so-called other places. Now let me dig into what I found a little bit more. So going back to fall 2014, when these students started at their two-year college STEM programs and courses, like the community college student body nationally, our study cohort's transfer aspirations were high. And also, I'll add, as a whole, they also largely mirror the diversity of the community college student population nationally. Fast forward 4 years later, our transfer aspiring students fell under 4 trajectories, which I call momentum trajectories. Roughly 40% of the students landed on the linear upward trajectory, meaning they transferred to a 4-year institution. But more alarmingly, about the same number of students were on the taking a break trajectory, having left their two-year institution without transfer and without receiving any post-secondary credential. About 13% of the students were on the detoured trajectory, where they had to piece together multiple institutional attendance or programs in order to transfer upward, oftentimes after recognizing that their initial institution or program was not a good fit for a variety of reasons. A final trajectory is deferred, with 9% of the students on it. These are the students who were initially determined to transfer, but had to let go of transfer to pursue a more short-term credential in order to make immediate returns to their education. Now, if we could pause for a moment and think, if we look at transfer as a simplistic binary measure of success, these trajectories would suggest that not all students, quote unquote, succeeded, but it is more nuanced than that. When I said that, I should particularly point out that the students across all trajectories were extraordinarily motivated and resilient. They held on to their aspirations, they were agentic, and they persevered amid some of the most extraordinary challenges in their life and education. And this is especially true among many students of color, women, and first-generation students. So these students' drive, motivation, agency, and so on, to me, really represent the assets that they are and that they possess from within themselves. And this is a very important part of the gist of the findings on my own, as embodied in my book title. However, there is also a very important and probably more alarmingly an external facet to On My Own, the major structural barriers that students encountered that largely left them on their own. So the students across the board, across all four trajectories, faced a number of common structural issues in their quest for transfer. They were faced with a lack of clear articulation in courses that applied to specific STEM majors. So the vague alignment between course and major requirements made it very difficult for the students to match up the right courses with program requirements. Then there were no clear course pathways that fit students' scheduling needs in light of their life, their work, and their other school obligations. And this is an incredibly important concern, as if we think about STEM courses, they tend to be highly and narrowly sequenced in a time-constrained manner, and this works against the community college students' need for greater flexibility in terms of course options and availability. On top of all that, perhaps most concerning is the utter scarcity of financial support for transfer students at all levels of financial aid policymaking, which obviously doesn't serve well a large student population coming from limited financial means. All of these structural issues, they fed into one another to adversely affect students in super confounded ways, but particularly disadvantaging those from low-income backgrounds who needed to work, and this is often intersecting with racial backgrounds and identities. So ultimately, many of these students were forced to make the difficult choice between transfer and work. And this is a very, very resounding theme among students on the detoured trajectory. Beyond the structural, it is equally important, if not more important, to take a closer look at STEM transfer students' experiences, both in connection with, but also more often beyond these structural issues. So through this research, especially our interview data that we collected from students, told me that students felt like they were on their own, and as a result, they adopted highly individual approaches to transfer. Often when students told us about how transfer was being configured and figured out, the institutional side of the story was largely missing from these students' narratives. Although I also want to acknowledge that instructors, advisors, services, and support were helpful, and that's true, and there's no denial of that, but they existed and happened in very incidental and unstructured ways. So much so that a student had to come in with a lot of know-how already to locate them, or occasionally rely on pure luck. Someone kind just happens to be there to teach this very class or to show up in this advising session. As a result, students often internalized lots of doubts and uncertainties when visualizing the path to transfer. And here again, I don't want to negate the fact that often the more so-called disadvantaged students persevered to define and chart their own success. But the structural barriers at work disrupted these students' experiences and educational path in very uneven, inequitable ways, which I am getting to in the very next slides and onward. Indeed, I found serious issues of concern around equity or lack thereof embedded within the trajectories followed by our students. In a nutshell, these trajectories are highly associated with the academic, social, and family resources available to the students, with students in the linear upward trajectory being the most advantaged and those underprivileged students concentrating in the other three trajectories, especially taking a break. Let's take a closer and quick look at the distributions of these trajectories among the entire cohort of the students. As an example, for this slide, these trajectories were a function of family income. Looking at the blue bar or the far left bar for each of the trajectories on this slide, for students from lowest income backgrounds, they were more likely to end up taking a break, being deferred or detoured than transferring upwards. In terms of race ethnicity, a disproportionately larger share of students of color fell under the taking a break trajectory compared with white students. Similarly, first-generation students were more likely to be in the other three trajectories than linear upward. And also I want to mention, these are coming from survey data and administrative records in terms of student background. But other than these data sources showing these disparities, we have rich interview data that allowed us to understand what is really going on the ground to explain these inequities, which I will summarize next. So what have I learned or not learned from these students' journeys over the years? I will say that the central findings that emerged were both alarming and hopeful. Alarming in the sense that my research was originally meant to illuminate a clear STEM transfer pathway. That was my naive, genuine goal coming into this work, but only to find that there was no clear pathways yet, and that the ways in which the current system was set up served to only further advantage those who were already fairly more advantaged than their peers. But the findings were also hopeful in the sense that despite adversities and roadblocks, the more underserved students still persevered and demonstrated the remarkable resilience in pursuit of their education. And like I mentioned before, many of them were able to chart their own success, especially if they happened to also encounter supportive instructors and advisors along the journey. But at the end of the day, as an institution, higher education cannot default to the remarkable agency and resilience among underserved and underrepresented students. So I want to send this message to caution myself and others against a very simplistic interpretation of on my own. While all students appear to be left to their own devices, they have unequal and inequitable access to the same devices, and the devices available to them are not of equal quality and utility. So I learned all of this But through all of this, I also unlearned my past implicit assumptions that by studying community colleges and transfer, and by working with and for community colleges and transfer, we were already addressing equity. I say this to transfer supporters, researchers, myself included, and practitioners alike. We're not exonerated from taking a close and difficult look at our own work that might have been complicit in not addressing equity the right way. With all that I've learned and unlearned, how do we promote equitable transfer in STEM? Let's first start with the structural level. To begin, both transfer receiving and sending institutions must actively and collaboratively flesh out institution and program-specific articulation agreements. Second, we must openly recognize that program faculty at both ends of the STEM transfer equation are equally responsible for equally important areas and stages of learning, and they must engage in co-creating learning objectives, streamlining courses across institutions. And next, programs should revisit academic scheduling to address the narrow access to transferable STEM courses and programs. So really optimize scheduling based on when students can actually take them without compromising their life and their other obligations, instead of defaulting on past practices. And this was always done in the past. Last but certainly not least, STEM programs might reconsider their current structures and sequences. When certain STEM, and particularly math courses, have long served as gatekeepers instead of gateways to success, we might really want to pause and disrupt our thinking that views these courses and the way they're structured as simply rigorous or inherently difficult or long. Instead, we might want to consider, instead of what was always done in the past, could there be better ways to transform these structures and sequences so that they can broaden access and engage students in more meaningful and productive ways? So these are some of the structural considerations. But our students don't just navigate the structural. They are experiencing structured opportunities, or often lack thereof, often inequitably, as I just shared. So it is critical when we address structural change or reform. There are so many initiatives around structural reform. We don't brush aside, when we do all of those, which is important, but we don't brush aside considerations around how students actually access and experience the structural. In that light, first, community colleges and four-year institutions on both ends must create a truly inclusive and empowering environment that supports students. And this means, frankly, working to combat implicit bias, stereotype threats, racism, sexism, and other types of bias and discrimination that are pretty pervasive in STEM fields of study in particular, which could result in the kinds of classroom and advising spaces as really safe havens for minoritized students to feel safe, and then they can start to explore and cultivate their genuine interest in STEM fields of study and transfer eventually. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating inequitable and less than supportive experiences that reinforce disparities in transfer pathways in STEM. Also, I want to say a word about advising, and I mean advising here broadly, including support in general, be it from advisors and instructors, especially community college students, given that their time engaging with the campus primarily concentrate in the classroom. The students do not always make that fine distinction between who's the advisor, who's the instructor. So I was really here talking about support in terms of advising in general. And we need to support the whole person. And two main issues I have found from student interviews in particular were inadequate or a complete absence of advising, along with a lack of a humanistic, culturally receptive, and responsive advising relationship. And especially thinking about now in this rapidly changing environment that in which we're all really experiencing a lot of disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic, relationship building is and will continue to be even more essential. And we need to be especially sensitive to the fact that for some students, making progress toward their educational goals appears to be just nearly impossible. Childcare, mental health, learning disabilities, so many other unemployment, so many issues of concern compounding and compromising their transfer plan, so to speak. So ways in which creatively in our own context that we can do in order to best meet those most vulnerable students' needs. And to get to the above, we need an equity-minded culture that intentionally practices deep, honest reflection, and this includes a full understanding of and action toward equity-mindedness. This is a transformative concept developed by Estella Benjamin and her team at USC. And also, I want to give a shout out to the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, led by Ebony Zamani Gallagher at UIUC, and they offer equity-guided resources that will be really informative in this particular regard. Finally, I'm fully aware that institutions are constrained within a larger policy context, which needs to move toward a more equity-oriented one. But as a starting point, institutions, and frankly you all, can be both drivers and actors in terms of building articulation policies that are clear, that are flexible, and that prioritize student diversity in order to resolve issues of persistent inequities. As we contend with these systemic challenges, so to you all, to the STEM community that I'm a part of, what can we do in the immediate now and near future? I offer these two reflective questions as a guide for our day-to-day practice. I know first-handedly, STEM teams in particular have a vast array of specific approaches at our disposal, but often it is easy to get lost in the weeds and just keep throwing out these strategies and tools to support students. I know I err in that regard as a teacher. But take a step back and take an introspective look inward and consider these two questions for everything we do in the moment of crisis, but also just in perpetuity. Do our efforts serve students justly by addressing their unique needs? Who is still not supported by our efforts? And most importantly, how can we change that? Why is asking, answering, and acting upon these two questions important to guide and potentially change our work? I hope this figure from my book, based on the culmination of all those findings, will shine some light on the various domains in our education system and society, and frankly, blind spots in our own thinking and practices that pose the so-called friction to STEM students' pathways to transfer, and particularly hurting those minoritized students in terms of race, gender, income, and such. This figure from my book shows that the current system serves to create multiple forces of friction, which is a process by which students were pushing through friction points, driven for the most part by their own internal motivational momentum. And this figure depicts the domains where the counter momentum friction resides that needs to be disrupted and removed. As you can see, some of the issues I outlined in the figure here are within our immediate control. They were advising, teaching, classroom relationships and such. But others are at the larger societal and systemic level. But even those larger issues do trickle down to our practices and influence how we think about and how we operationalize about supporting students on a daily basis. So they are also kind of our problems. So using those two reflective big questions I shared in the previous slide as a guide, I view this figure as a map for us to identify blind spots and enact change to cultivate equitable STEM transfer pathways. Speaking of which, let's come back to this fundamental question I posed to you all at the beginning of this webinar. What do equitable STEM transfer pathways mean and look like? I realize I do enjoy asking questions. I am sure some of you have already charted your own vision, but for me, all these complexities around with this on my own list for STEM transfer students translate into this. If we were serious about supporting all transfer students in STEM and beyond equitably and building a truly equitable STEM transfer pathway, then in fact, we do not assume that we're already addressing equity just by working on transfer issues and by being in this community. And we must intentionally redouble our efforts to support the most vulnerable, even within this transfer population that we deeply care about. It means we do not assume sameness. We do not assume sameness in our students and our practices. It means we start to disrupt our assumptions, those that we've long taken for granted about our students, about the best ways to teach, the best ways to learn, and even the best ways to support and to care. It means that we engage in a never-ending reflective journey to travel outside of our comfort zone to be ready for the students instead of expecting the students to be ready for us or our standards that assume sameness across all students. Only then can we even begin our efforts to build a culture in support of equitable access, experiences, and outcomes for all STEM transfer students. So eventually, what does an equitable STEM transfer path or STEM transfer journey look like? I wanted to show you this figure that captured some of my thinking based on years of data collection, thinking, and writing of the On My Own book. I've touched upon many of these elements already, but here I want to bring to light a few key sort of global, larger picture considerations. I want to first emphasize that transfer receiving and transfer sending institutions should be equal, active, and proactive partners in supporting STEM transfer students. And the students, from firsthand research, and I'm sure many of you know, they are deeply impacted by both ends of the process of transfer. And here, particularly, transfer receiving baccalaureate institutions, we must not let our community college partners to shoulder the primary responsibility that has been the case historically. And we need to step up throughout the entire process, not just post the point of transfer. The second larger picture consideration I was wrestling with is that when we consider structural issues, such as articulation, and individual aspects, such as relationship building, we must account for the many life contexts and realities of community college students so they don't have to make the hard choices between school and work and family, and oftentimes because of narrow access to courses and or a lack of understanding of these contexts on the part of their well-intended advisors and instructors, and or a lack of sufficient financial resources. And here, with the mission of STEM, this set of issues actually pose very complex and nuanced conundrums because oftentimes the assumption is that in STEM programs, we support low-income students, so there's scholarship provided to them. But the danger of that approach without deep reflexivity is that, the students were already provided pretty generous financial support, and they should be good, they should be engaging in this and that. But oftentimes I found from my more recent research, which is outside of this particular book, was that low-income students and also many low-income students of color, they come from their own community and family context where their support, financial support back to the family and communities and emotional support matter the world to them and to their communities. So sometimes, the kind of scholarship available to them goes somewhere, but it doesn't go a whole long way. So when you see a student as funded by some programs kind of appearing to be struggling, and then you realize they're taking outside jobs, what was your first reaction? Should that be that all the students were just not taking this opportunity seriously? That's actually one of the findings from this other study I was referencing. Or should we be pausing and thinking about whether there is a much more transformative and responsive and relevant approaches that we can adopt to fully account students as truly this whole human being situated within their community and cultural and familial context. So I wanted to unpack this a little before moving forward. And then third, this is the third and the final global larger picture consideration about this pathway. So everything we do in terms of support and when and how it is provided and to whom, we must be extremely careful to make sure students would have equitable and easy access to all of it. And this is very, very important when we think about some of the transfer advising or transfer support models where you might hold sessions, in-person visits and virtual, especially now. But then are they occurring frequently enough to accommodate all the scheduling needs? And was that information out there easily accessible rather than this just one singular channel, which oftentimes may not be broadly accessible to all of the students because of their bandwidth and because they were attending to so many other important matters in their lives. As I was preparing for this webinar, I was also fully aware that we're still in the midst of this multifaceted moment of crisis. So the pandemic and racial injustice and so on. And interestingly, in this unprecedented situation, I guess we all are also reminded of where our passion and commitments are, and that we must redouble our efforts to ensure that the most vulnerable students among those we serve are not lost during this disruptive time. Excuse me. So I want to close my presentation with a few words. I'm losing my voice. I want to close my presentation with a few words on supporting STEM transfer students amid crisis. First, we already know that the process for transfer has been disrupted for many students during this crisis. So going the extra mile then past practices to provide support, flexibility, and extended timelines is crucial for transfer students. And second, especially those on the transfer receiving end, being responsive and creative to support and accommodate transfer is a must. I definitely don't pretend to be an expert on the ground. Many of you are, but some general areas, for instance, considering the transfer process during the current crisis include credit transfer for some of the online classes that were just suddenly converted from in-person. Our practices around pass and fail, how do they matter? How do they factor into the GPA requirements for transfer? And then deferred transfer enrollment. I mean, some students might have to forego this immediate opportunity, but then should this be just the end of their journey? And so on. There are so many other areas. I'm sure you will come up with very creative solutions depending on your local context. Finally, I want to throw this out there. Often, and I've been actually reflecting quite a bit on my own practices in my teaching and advising, so I'm not excusing myself when I say this. Often in our hastiness to provide support to students on an individual level, we forget to pause and acknowledge and advocate for transfer students as incredible assets to us and to institutions and to society. The COVID-19 crisis, if anything, points to the urgency in developing STEM professionals to address a multitude of societal, community, and health needs. Community colleges and their students, in that light, are primed to rise to the occasion and come up with innovative and thoughtful solutions, as they always have historically, in terms of being responsive, in terms of being adaptive to societal needs. And community college students, aka prospective transfer students, including those in my study, I noticed first-handedly from studying them for over the years, they are deeply involved with and dedicated to serving their communities with the education they need. For baccalaureate institutions and STEM programs, if there were ever a most critical time and need to enroll and support STEM transfers, it is now. I want to leave you with a quote from Canada. She is a Native American woman in my study who was highlighted as someone on the deferred trajectory in my book. She was an IT student. Canada had an almost perfect academic record. She always wanted to transfer, but she made the most painful and difficult decision over her final semester at the community college. She had to defer to take a job in order to support her family, her two disabled brothers, and herself due to the lack of financial support for transfer. And in my most recent communication with Canada, just a few weeks ago, you do this research and sometimes the relationship becomes a long-term one in the best possible sense. And in that conversation, she shared she was just gearing up to possibly extend her education while still working full-time. And this is what she said to me over Zoom when sharing how she's been doing since I last interviewed her around 2 years ago. This is what Candace said. I know participating through the study, it made me think how I can be the change in tech. It's giving me a lot of ideas about how to improve diversity in tech, really promoting pathways through two-year colleges, especially being a woman, being Native American, and really wanting to promote the background of what I can see our future of technology would be like. Because we can't build the future unless we have the future fully represented in it. So Canada and hundreds of thousands of her prospective STEM transfer peers nationally each year, whether they eventually decided to transfer or not, by choice, they should have a supported pathway broadly and equitably available and accessible to them. They are the future. So you've been such a great audience, and no one interrupted me, and everyone was nodding in my imagination. So if you found my presentation to be helpful, I encourage you to be in touch, and we can talk more. Also, I encourage you to check out my book. I'm biased, but although I've always been proud of my work, I was never this excited about my work because of the learning and, most importantly, the kind of unlearning I shared with you through working on this research in this book. I know we're going to do Q&A shortly, but just in case I wasn't able to address all of your questions, do email and pick up the conversation from there. And I'll turn this over to Iris next.
So thank you, Shuli. We'll actually go into the Q&A section right now, and then I will give a close out after your Q&A section.
That sounds perfect. That sounds good. Okay, I'm now opening. Did you hear echoing? So audience members, I'm now just navigating to the attendee questions box. So bear with me. And okay. Yeah, so I have the first question. What is the difference between detoured and deferred? So John, you were talking about the two of the four trajectories I just shared. So detoured were those students in my study, over the years, they still continuously intend to transfer, but they had to either move laterally between two-year institutions or switch programs within their institutions in order to find a better fit or pathway in order to transfer. So at the close of the study, they were kind of still hanging there, enrolled in their two-year colleges with the intent to transfer, but they've been kind of detoured along the process over the course of 4 years. And deferred were those students who consistently aspire to transfer throughout their time at their two-year institution. But at the close of the study, they took a job, and often due to the reason that they would have to earn some money and to have some immediate returns to their education. So to them, transfer is deferred in that sense. And my next question is also coming from John. Hi, John. Again, of the 25% of two-year college students who are not interested in linear upward are removed from the data presented, another great data question. Yes, in the when I showed you the first slide, that's the overall sample, and then the overall sample obviously is slightly over 1,600 students. And then when I was showing the four trajectories, that's indeed limited to only transfer aspiring students. Okay, next question, also coming from John. Does the term linear upward denigrate the choice of not to continue to pursue further education? I think if I'm reading your question correctly, John, I think when I view the ways I named those trajectories, I was trying to be very descriptive of what happened or where they ended up over the course of 4 years. And so I definitely was not intending any sort of value judgment per se. So I will say by following up with some of these students, even beyond the course of the study recently, many of them continue to pursue education formally and informally. So as I mentioned earlier, and also as I detailed in some of my own work, I do not view these pathways, and certainly not the binary definition of transfer, as a success yardstick. So next question comes from Julia. Regarding gateway courses structures, what are some examples of how the change in mindset has been made at institutions? I like the idea of reframing, but I'm having a hard time visualizing what that actually looks like. I'm so glad, Julia, thank you for this question that you brought up mindset, and because it's extremely difficult. And I can only share briefly from my research in close collaboration with math faculty members at two-year institutions, math in terms of math department math in developmental education, and math in technical fields of study. And mindset is really fundamental, because what that actually looks like would mean structurally we eliminate some of the prerequisites. Like a lot of the developmental math redesign is predicated on this idea, there is too much math going on sequentially that deters students. And so structurally, it would look very disruptive, quote unquote. But then on the ground, I think faculty mindset is probably the most difficult to change, because we have to structural reform would have to come from willing and convinced change agents on the ground, and that is often the faculty and disciplinary faculty in STEM or math faculty in general. They're dedicated educators. But I think we are all constrained, myself included, in our disciplinary training about certain historical ways to structure our courses the way they've done in the past. So working with math faculty at a number of two-year institutions around contextualization, this whole idea of math contextualization, I see a lot of well-justified fear in terms of, math is supposed to be abstract and taught rigorously rather than in a highly applied and contextualized fashion. So there is a lot of good friction and struggle around mindset shift. But I would say we're all learners, and I'm not suggesting that we just have to change the whole system. The larger idea is to be reflective and to pause and to question long-standing practices we've taken for granted. And so I think that probably is the larger issue. But I do completely agree that mindset is hard. And I'll offer just one final piece from my earlier research analyzing post-secondary students' transcript records nationally. I found that students who successfully transfer in STEM areas of study at four-year institutions, their course patterns, one of the most frequently occurring course patterns for successful STEM transfer students was actually associated with taking a STEM subject matter course first, followed by college level math, which is kind of counterintuitive as to how sort of gatekeeping of a role math has always played. Okay, the next question is from Jennifer. Can you elaborate on what some particularly fruitful partnerships between community colleges and receiving institutions look like? Such a good question. Thank you, Jennifer. I know, again, you're all experts on the field and you have specific examples. And I think several important characteristics come to mind. Number one is the partnership would have to be situated within this common commitment and understanding with regard to transfer students as assets. I can't say enough of how important this is. Historically, community college students carry most of the weight, if not all weight, and say, take our students, they're great, take our students. And on the four-year receiving end, individual levels, transfer advisors were wonderful, but I was talking about systemically, transfers were viewed as sort of, they were not as well prepared, so there's a lot of unjust stigma associated with a community college education and then transfer students coming from community colleges. So I think before entering any sort of partnerships between four-year institutions, take a space, a venue, or maybe repeatedly to kind of check some of our assumptions. How do we view transfer students from both ends? So earlier in my presentation, I mentioned the fact that we don't want to always just rest at the individual level, being a good person, being a good educator, in support of transfer students individually. But actually, research has shown transfer students were as successful as rising juniors. And research has also shown that they only experience probably just a very immediate dip in their academic performance, and then they just came back right up on par in terms of their academic performance. So I think the kinds of common understanding, viewing transfer students as asset, and that is a very important common ground for this kind of partnership. And then another characteristic that comes to mind is also this kind of continuous understanding or working toward equalizing is not the right word, but we first have to elevate and amplify the voices of our community college partners. And four-year institutions, this is where I am situated, we really have historical privilege relative to our community college partners. And so we should recognize that and use our privilege for greater good. And so this means, who gets to participate, who gets to decide the agenda, who gets to provide input in the best practices in support of transfer. So equitable would be the second characteristic in terms of partnerships. And then finally, it's more of a literal sense. I, at least in my own practices, and I see success in the other partners that I've seen, physically we go to our community college partners instead of expecting them to come to us. We go to community college campuses to meet with transfer students, and now we virtually reach out to them to provide that kind of infrastructure and space so that they don't have to carry all the burden. I'm so enjoying this conversation, but I need to move on. Thank you, Jennifer. So, Pamela, next question coming from Pamela. This is amazing. Thank you. It's amazing to be in community with you all. Thank you so much. Can you please give examples of best practices of your suggestion of academic scheduling for easy, broad, and equitable access to transferable STEM courses? Yes. I wrote a page or two about this in my book. If I have a reasonable memory from what I wrote, I think one example is block schedule. So meaning that students will be taking a cluster of transferable classes in a fairly concentrated time, rather than, they have to be here Monday through Friday because, who knows, there is a transferable course just right there in the middle of their scheduling. And because, some of the students were parents and they have childcare, they have other places to be in. And so block scheduling is a good example to make the most intensive and very meaningful and efficient use of student time. And I think another approach is to really broaden and take a close look at what is being offered and broaden the menu of transferable courses. And I'll use an example from my study. There was a student on the detoured trajectory, meaning that they were just, they were just detoured. There were no clear pathway out of that loop. And because she continued to miss that one singular chemistry class that was the only transferable option. And quoting her, Seamus, that's her name, and she chose as an alias for the study. And she said there's a number of looking similar chemistry course, and she literally said you can cam this, cam that, cam this, cam that, but there's only one that eventually turned out to be transferable, and missing that one key transferable course, and then that kind of set the whole time back for a year. So I think broadening our menu, this obviously goes back to articulation, but that would be a change more at the structural level. And next question is from David. Could you describe some of the articulation issues you identified? Yes, thank you, David. And I think from the mega level of policy, I think one of the, in terms of equitable transfer, the topic we're focusing on today, the larger articulation landscape, the biggest issue to me is that equity indicators are not incorporated, or at least not comprehensively incorporated. And obviously, we all operate within the policy context. If there is no, there's basically no money where our mouth is, and it definitely affects our day-to-day practices. So this is a very important issue of concern. I am cautiously heartened that the Higher Learning Commission and other accrediting bodies started a conversation. Maybe they will be implementing actually equity indicators in reaccreditation practices. Despite all the intended, unintended consequences, I do believe equity indicators should be factored into our accountability system across multiple levels, starting with mega level policy making. And then in terms of some of the institutional and program specific level articulation issues. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice, but I'm good. Okay. I think one of the most concerning and almost heartbreaking issues is that a lot of states, in fact, include the state in my study, have invested a tremendous amount of resources in establishing those agreements and have very technology savvy kinds of systems to kind of chart the map in terms of work courses articulate, work programs articulate. However, what is sad about this is oftentimes there is multiple layers of disconnect between what is in the system, what is in the books, and the kind of training, developments, and support advisors and faculty members, for that matter, receive in terms of what works, what articulation agreements, or basically they don't have to even use the word articulation, but in terms of how to translate that information into, instructor advising context. And so when a student, goes to someone for guidance and they were able to point them toward, or maybe they can just personally explain what is the right path to follow. In so many of the student interviews for this work, many instructors through students' accounts where they were not able to tell, and even sometimes advisors, despite their best intentions and hard work, they were sharing inaccurate information with students, and it's not really their fault. So I think there's got to be a better system for easy, flexible, and accessible flow of information with regard to how articulation policies are being operationalized on the ground and communicated to those educators and then in turn to students. So those are just a few of the key issues coming to mind, but there are more. Sorry, I don't want to butcher your name, Ramki. Thank you for the, okay. I'm looking for question marks. Thank you. Challenges. One of the challenges I'm seeing in STEM and engineering in particular is that while a large number of students start out with an interest in engineering, by the end, they're ready to do an actual engineering class. More than 75% have already decided not to pursue engineering for various reasons. Have you seen any efficacy for a more streamlined track of study with cohorts that help retain students? Yeah, great question. I think here are where my thoughts are. I think there are definitely, even through NSF funded programs, and you will be able to identify more focused lines of inquiry or practice that are aligned with specific STEM pathways such as engineering. So I don't want to mispresent that knowledge base, and so that's just a side. I will say that when we think about the intersected nature of STEM programs and disciplines, I don't view this as a zero-sum game. And for instance, I personally feel actually pretty okay and even inspired when students, through their exploration of certain STEM courses, and then they realize this did not best align with their commitment and interest and who they are, and they switch to another STEM area, or maybe just switching out of STEM in general. I think that's perfectly fine. And so I think my first larger point is more philosophical. I feel as long as we're really working to broaden student access to the kinds of pathways with STEM being a very important facet of their educational journey, because we all recognize the importance and the value of learning happening within STEM. And I think I'm fine. And actually here, one of my collaborators at a four-year institution working with community colleges, they were on a STEM team, and oftentimes she even advised prospective transfer students when she realized and their better fit is another four-year institution. So philosophically, I feel if, this kind of not lack of retention or this movement at the student level across STEM majors and beyond is coming from their from just choice, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Having said that, I think to your question about studies and ways in which to better stay students so that they have this more streamlined and straightforward pathway. Nobody wants to detour, so that I get that, and I think it is very important to cultivate that kind of sense of belonging within STEM, and cultivating their identity as a STEM learner, of course, discipline specific. And I have so many amazing community college researchers in my community who do this work, just to name one, Sarah Rodriguez at Texas A&M Commerce Campus. And, there's a lot of research that has been done in terms of how to cultivate STEM identity and sense of belonging from the early on. And so I think that line of work is really worth checking out, even though that's most research, and the studies do have a lot of implications in terms of our study. And some of the things I mentioned earlier today about we have to make sure our advising spaces and classroom spaces are really safe enough and not really threatening to students. And also related to that consideration, I think across maybe engineering and maybe other fields of study, IT, sometimes we hold on to this meritocratic point of view, and we say things like talented people succeed in this field, and that's very discouraging. It's probably well-intended coming from instructors. And so after my students in my interview told me that, I was going back to all the language I used in my own teaching that could be actually damaging to students. So I think that kind of earlier sense of belonging disciplinarily, is that word, is going to be one important factor to consider moving forward. And next question is from Eva. Did you look at the impact of STEM centers? In my research, I found that students-oriented, equity-minded STEM centers can make a large difference in connecting students with each other, with faculty and co-curricular sources of support, and much more. And thank you. Yes, I actually think, without knowing too much of the background of what you were referencing in terms of STEM centers, but just based on your brief description, Eva, here, I think it really seems a super amazing approach, because we can't address equity issues when we don't even name them. That's why I keep saying we can't assume sameness. So just by your description, the center is framed around, equity-mindedness, and it seems to be a remarkable direction to follow. It seems exemplary to me, although I can't offer more detailed responses to that, but definitely it seems like the right way to move forward with. Liang Zhou, next question. Comes to the next question from community college students. If they can easily find a job after their 2-year degree, they may not want to continue their education in a 4-year college. Is there any way to encourage those community college students to transfer to a 4-year college? This is such a good question, Liang. I think this is going back to where is our value, philosophically, what does social mobility really means? Oftentimes I heard from my practitioner colleagues and researchers alike and say, yes, transfer is all great and such, but community colleges serve so many missions and so many functions with which I completely, full-heartedly agree, and that's the reason why I fell in love with community colleges. At the same time, however, what I found from my years of research, not just this longitudinal study, is that oftentimes it's not by choice. We have students persistently wanting to transfer, like Kanda, whose story was so inspiring to me. But she exhausted all the resources and she studied all the transferable options. And then it was not until her final semester, and Kanda was not alone in this case, and meaning that, they with or without the students seeing explicitly, oftentimes they were constrained. They did not have a full slew of choices to make. So I think to your question, Liang, about is there any way to encourage those students to transfer to a four-year college? I think on the individual level, obviously through all the relationship building from day one, a genuine platform and a relationship building process that allows students to figure out their aspirational and their sort of aspects of their education journey. So where they want to be within the next couple of years, where they want to be within the next decade. And so I think continued clarification of what their true educational aspirations are is important. However, beyond the individual level, I really, really think at the systemic level, if a student, want to change their mind and they realize, they want to go on and forward, there has to be a system broadly accessible and equitably accessible to all of them. So it's only really by choice that they made the decision to not transfer, rather than, literally out of reach financially. Literally, this is the kind of campus environment that's really not representing and accommodating who I am. So, those are some of the ideas. Andrea, next question. Your data presented the breakdown of characteristics within the trajectory. How do the trajectories of minoritized or disadvantaged groups compare? For example, among first-generation students, do they tend to take a particular trajectory? And thanks, so we were nodding with you. Thank you, Andrea, for offering that feedback. Yes, and I think, Andrea, your hunch feeling is definitely spot on. The few slides that I showed you include only a number of minoritized backgrounds and identities, and across the board, I would say the pattern is pretty persistent in terms of students who come from underserved backgrounds, marginalized identities tend to following one of the other three trajectories, and taking a break and detoured or deferred. I don't know whether this is what you're also getting at. I was going to say, even though I didn't present all the data dissected across the whole range of identities and intersectionality thereof, I will say, being immersed with this data, when we really kind of, slice and dice the data all kinds of ways, indeed, it proves heartbreakingly the fact that the students with the most minoritized backgrounds and identities tend to be the ones who, despite their transfer aspirations, did not really get well served by the system. So even if we look at specific racial groups, and even when we intersect gender and race and class, for instance. Okay, so next question is from Gary. Does your data set analysis include individuals with criminal backgrounds, their special challenges in pathways, support, special needs, etc.? Yes, and this is no. The question, the answer to your first question is unfortunately no, because of some of the constraints that with the NSF funded some of the parameters associated with this particular project, and also some sampling criteria issues. But with regard to incarcerated individuals and students, they actually, even though the study wasn't designed that way, anecdotally, I will say that in my interviews, there were a couple of students during the course of the study, they experienced incarceration, and then they were, from their experiences, what they could share with me, and this is really the kind of heartwarming part, and they felt their two-year institution gave them the second and the third chance, and then that's the place where their heart was being nurtured. This was from one of the participant quotes, and I don't have data that, in research terms, that were saturated enough for me to speak more broadly about this issue, but having those interview findings from a couple of students was something that has been sticking with my mind. And also, Gary, you have a question, gender differences. Yes, we have done a couple of studies with regard to women's experiences, and then there are STEM transfer pathways. And so in my book, I have a particular chapter dedicated to the women participants in my study. Differences, it's interesting. Women tend to be on par with men in terms of linear upward. And then, but then in terms of the other three, and they were also more likely to be concentrating in the detoured or deferred trajectory, and disproportionately less women were in the taking a break trajectory. And from the interview data, I will say that women were extraordinarily resilient, and they also actually combated a lot of sexism, stereotypes, and just sometimes blatant sexism in sometimes classroom spaces. But women in my study, I admire them so much, and they also demonstrated such resilience, and because of their often many identities, and those identities were together, both driving them to succeed. At the same time, there are also the pull factors. So the findings around women were really, really nuanced. So if we look at just their academic path, they are as successful, if not more successful, compared to men. And thinking about this is really, we're talking about STEM. But I attribute, based on the data and analysis, I attribute this pattern more really to their capacity to just hold on fiercely to their education journey because of their dedication to all kinds of obligations that they have. I think the next question is from Leroy. Leroy, how does 2-year to 4-year summer bridge program impact student transfer and retention success? Oh, this is such a good question, because one of the students I just mentioned earlier, and she was also representing the detoured trajectory, Seamus, and she was actually a product of a summer bridge program. But then with her experience, it was that the bridge program conceptually and operationally really offered a good window to what a 4-year STEM major and experience could look like. And so this is definitely a very rigorous idea. But there comes some issues with that too, is that students through the summer bridge program, at least the students in my study who had this experience, and they have this very intensified, short windowed experience that was for the most part very positive. And so for Seamus, and with experience with bridge, and she was exceedingly interested in pursuing, a bachelor's degree in engineering in this case, and she literally, just enjoyed the bridge experience was a blast. But then when she, had landed her feet on the four-year campus, and then there was all kinds of issues, advising or lack of meaningfulness as she experienced and perceived in her engineering classes, because she couldn't really resonate with the way the courses were taught. And so this is a more realistic, full display of the kind of environment in engineering at a baccalaureate campus that doesn't quite align with her bridge experience. So I think this larger issue is that when we are trying to think about recruiting women, recruiting students of color, recruiting students from low-income backgrounds and to our STEM programs, whether it's community colleges or four-year institutions, access is just beginning. It's just one piece, but then how they actually are being supported and how they experience and this holistic set of experiences and learning once they're here is a much longer term issue of concern. So if all the key ingredients with Bridge are completely infused across post-secondary education experience for all students, and I think then we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. I think that's the bottom of the priority question box. How are we doing in terms of time?
We have about 5 more minutes if there are additional questions, and if you still have a voice left. If not, we can close out now and I give some closing thoughts. So, Shuli, could you advance to the last slide, please?
Yes. Is it not showing?
No, it's not.
Interesting. On my end, probably there's a delay. On my end, it's showing. Let me do it one more time. How about now?
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shuli, for an amazing presentation. And thank you again to the audience for asking such great questions. We were really just excited about having this webinar on equitable STEM transfer pathways for community college students, and from the looks of it, it looks like you all were really appreciated this webinar also. So again, thank you for joining us today. Please complete the survey. You will receive a follow-up email, and you'll also see the survey link that'll be pushed to you shortly, or probably already has been. Please complete the survey, because this helps us as we're organizing the rest of the webinars that we have planned for this year. So we have one scheduled for September and our final one for November. So these surveys definitely help us to assess these presentations and how helpful and beneficial they are to you. Also, please share any resources or announcements that you would like us to disseminate on our website. You can send those to Allison at agonzalez@AAAS.org. And finally, please follow us and share, tag us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Our LinkedIn site is the AAAS STEM Initiative, and our Twitter handle is STEM_program. Thank you so much, and again, please complete the survey. We hope you can join us for our next webinar, which will be scheduled in September. And please visit our STEM website to view our prior webinar recordings and slides. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the day.